Hey Grinders, Emory again. This week we're releasing some very special bonus episodes of discussions that Joe and I had at State of the Net 2018, the largest internet policy conference in the country, hosted last week in Washington, D.C. by our parent organization, the Internet Education Foundation. Today we're continuing the releases with one of my all-time favorite discussions of the day, where Joe and I got to talk with Sanja Kelly of Freedom House about the state of internet freedom around the world. Sanja Kelly is the director for Freedom on the Net, a project of Freedom House that assesses global internet freedom, and gave us our favorite quote of the day. Stay tuned and let us know what you think about China's continual negative iteration. I found this discussion completely fascinating, and we really hope you do too. So remember to keep it tuned right here all week, as we have more excellent interviews just like this coming all week, including discussions on fake news, disagreement over net neutrality, and cybersecurity at the Olympics. So enjoy our chat with Sanja Kelly at State of the Net 2018.
Hey Tech Policy Grinders, this is Joe Jerome sitting next to Emory. We're still here at State of the Net talking to people about awesome stuff in tech policy. We are actually joined at the moment by Sanja Kelly. She is the director of Freedom of the Net at Freedom House. She was on a session here at State of the Net on the big provocative question of the day of whether is the internet disrupting democracy. So Sanja, I guess that's the question we can pose to you right now. Is the internet disrupting democracy?
Well, the internet is certainly changing democracy, and in some ways it's changing it for the better, but in many other ways it's changing it for the worse. Let me just backtrack and mention that I work at Freedom House, where I evaluate the state of internet freedom in 65 countries. So what we do is we look at different policies, whether that be blocking and filtering. We look at what people say and do online, whether they get arrested or attacked for those things. And we collect a whole lot of data on an annual basis. And then we assert what the annual trends are. So when we look at all of our findings throughout the year, we see many scary things. This year, for example, we wrote extensively about how governments are using the internet to manipulate and undermine democracy. So obviously that's something that's quite worrisome. In fact, while a lot of governments and a lot of people here in the United States are focused on Russian manipulation of the elections here in the US, one of the things that we have observed is that this is a worldwide trend. In fact, over the past year alone, elections were influenced in 18 countries throughout the world. So again, something quite worrisome, and it really comes at the core of democracy is, because if people can't elect their leaders based on credible information, then we can say that, basic processes are being undermined. So that's just one way that is clearly negative. But at the same time, throughout the years, I know that I have personally observed and collected data on so many examples how the internet has actually brought greater transparency, even to the countries that have traditionally been some of the most oppressive countries throughout the world. I've come across examples where even officials in Saudi Arabia were fired or had to respond because people pressured them through social media, through Twitter, for example. Even looking at, in Saudi Arabia, women's campaign to enable women to drive, that's something that women's rights activists have been pushing for decades. But I think kind of the last straw in that battle was actually their ability to push it on social media, to post videos of women driving and really kind of breaking some of the social norms, which then led the government and the royal family to loosen up some of those restrictions. So we are seeing in many ways the incredible potential of the internet, but at the same time, many of the governments realizing what that positive force is, they're then coming up and cracking down on all of these positive things.
So how do we push back against that? I mean, is there a message you have for governments or advocates or people on the ground to push back against?
Well, absolutely. So it seems like that we really need to support grassroots internet freedom organizations in many of these countries around the world. We've seen, particularly over the last 5 years, many governments actually legislating on how the internet and on internet speech and on surveillance. And a lot of people see internet policy as something that's techy, that they don't necessarily understand. So we've seen in many places, legislation that deals with credible and serious issues like cybersecurity, suddenly having these provisions where, which say, the type of let's say terrorist speech is prohibited, this or that. But by the way, here's an amendment that if you criticize the king of my country, you will go to jail for 15 years. So, we're constantly seeing these amendments slipping in.
Sure.
So actually supporting civil society in these countries actually combat that legislation is really crucial in this effort.
Yeah, it's clearly a very complex issue with lots of different moving parts, and I think that it's maybe even too broad of a question in the first place, right? Because as you said,
Sorry.
like no, not that you were personal.
No,
The idea of is technology good for democracy? Because like you said, it's clearly good at helping grassroots organization and activism. Maybe we can make that jump as well. But at the same time, it sounds like the cybersecurity implications and maybe the surveillance infrastructure that is necessarily established with technology makes it more difficult to have elections.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the issue of surveillance. I mean, of course, surveillance can be used for very legitimate law enforcement purposes. But what we've seen in a number of countries, whether that be Thailand and Russia or China or Vietnam, is that governments without any checks and balances are actually using their security and surveillance apparatuses to observe what their political opposition is doing, what human rights activists are doing, and then using that information that they collect without any checks and balances to imprison them, to attack them, or retaliate in many other ways.
But at the same time, I mean, not to paint it with like overly simplistic brush, but the folks that are shutting down elections right now in the name of their, in their government, they were trying to disrupt those elections before technology, right?
Exactly.
Is the technology making it significantly cheaper or easier for this kind of disruption, or is it just making it more trackable?
Well, I think that so many of those countries, I mean, they did not have free and fair elections,
Right,
and I think like that's the bottom line. So then what technology enabled was actually for people to inform one another when irregularities happen. So in the past, authorities in places like Thailand or Vietnam, they could cheat and they can say hush hush and no one's going to know about it. But with the internet, you can easily take evidence. You can take a video or take a picture, circulate it, and suddenly the entire country is aware of the problem. So then when that happens, then many of the authorities then feel threatened, and then in response they either block many of the websites or many of the tools, or they shut down the internet altogether, what we have seen in many countries actually over the past few years.
Is there anybody doing I guess I want to say any government doing a particularly good job? I know, so at the Center for Democracy and Technology, we've sort of been watching some of the hate speech stuff in Europe with alarm, just because it's overly
That's
broad. Right. There's a lot of just confusion going on in the United States right now, and I always feel like, at least Western Europe, the United States were sort of internet leaders. Has anybody else sort of stepped up to the plate?
Well, it's really interesting because Estonia, for example, ranks as number one in our survey on
Go
a country.
Estonia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I know for a lot of people who are not in this field, they are surprised.
Well, Estonians, don't they get public-private key pairs instead of social security numbers?
Exactly.
Awesome.
So, I mean, to me, Estonia is such an incredible story because, here's a country that was part of the former Soviet Union, and after they declared independence, they actually realized that they're a country that is not necessarily big or doesn't have, some super, supernatural resources like oil. So they really took introspective look and said, well, we are going to actually invest in information technology, and that's going to be our thing. So they have created this incredible infrastructure, which then actually ended up getting strengthened even more after cyber attacks perpetrated by Russia about 10 years ago.
Right.
So they had these massive debilitating cyber attacks that attacked their government offices, their banks, and after that they actually used it as a lesson, and they invested so heavily in cybersecurity that they became actually one of the world leaders when it comes to this. So then you have this tiny country now being a leader in many of these issues.
So I don't know nearly enough about Estonia, only that I am very impressed by it. Can you tell us a little more about technically or policy-wise what they've done and how they what lessons can we take from Estonia, and what should we be implementing?
And can I interrupt? So maybe I'm missing a story here. Did they have a They have biometric identifiers, right? Was there a breach of that recently, or is that something I'm making up?
I don't believe that there was a breach of that. So they have this national ID system and essentially a national ID key. So basically, as part of their entire government system is online, and each citizen can then access it and see their public records. So basically, you can go to your national system and you can see everything from your grades, like when you were in kindergarten to your health records, and
in one big place.
In one big place, which sounds extremely scary.
Yes.
Which sounds so it's extremely scary, but they seem to be pretty proud of their system because they have built-in kind of checks and balances in terms of security checks, but then also kind of balances in terms of how government may or may not access that information. Okay. So for example, if the police ever wants to access this, then you as a citizen, when you log in, you actually have the record that the police actually accessed and the date and time of that.
Is there any exception for national security purposes?
So apparently that record needs to appear then within 3 to 6 months. If so, there can be a delay for national security purposes as opposed to immediately. But essentially that still has to come within a particular time frame, which is pretty incredible.
Oh yeah.
And apparently if the government then accesses this and they don't find anything, then they actually need to issue an apology letter that they can access this. Exactly.
Oh, that is laughable in America.
Yes.
The idea is literally laughable.
Exactly. So, I mean, to me, I have to say that although I've heard Estonian cybersecurity specialists make points that this, that they have built layers and layers of security in this, I have to say it makes me uneasy, regardless of how democratic their government is.
Right.
I mean, it is a subject potentially to threats. So, I think that could be another discussion. But in many ways, it is quite an impressive system.
Oh, sure.
All right, and so let's go to the other end of the list.
Yes.
Who should we be most concerned about in the internet freedom world?
So among the 65 countries that we examined, China comes in as the last. And China is such an interesting place, I think, for us analytically as well, because it really has the most sophisticated apparatus of both censorship and surveillance. But then at the same time, they have become so adept in using the internet to promote economic growth.
Right.
So then, it is a place where people can go to prison for 10 years or more for, criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, or, where we had seen people in Tibet, for example, being imprisoned simply for pulling up a picture of Dalai Lama in the cyber cafe.
Wow.
But then, as I mentioned, we've seen technology rapidly evolving, and that's the level of innovation there is actually quite scary.
So has that score gotten worse over time, or is it on a trending better, or, I mean...
So they are consistently innovating in a negative way.
That's such a perfect... Oh, I love that soundbite. I've never used that.
That's just great. It has so much applicability to all sorts of conversations.
Yeah.
Negative innovation. I like it.
Innovating in a negative direction.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I mean, just looking at some of the new policies, for example, recently China passed a new cybersecurity policy, which, among other things, mandates that all data pertinent to Chinese citizens now has to be stored in China, in mainland China, which is actually
data localization law.
Exactly, data localization laws, which is presenting a lot of headache for foreign companies that are operating in China. But this entire cybersecurity policy is actually one step forward to this kind of like a new social credit system that China is hoping to implement actually by year 2020, where all citizens will essentially be graded based on their internet activity. So in the same sense that we in the United States have a personal credit score, in China people are going to have this social credit score.
I think that's fascinating, and I think in my space, my initial gut reaction is this is going to be used for ill. But I guess if I can play devil's advocate, that sort of using technology for a scoring of a person could have a lot of benefits. Emory looks shocked.
I am shocked, and I am going to allow you to elaborate.
You think about, we haven't even discussed things like hate speech and bots and the way bad actors use the internet for ill. These sorts of tools are sort of a
bot killer.
It's a policing mechanism in some respects. And the story that I've heard in China is, people have there've been announcements on the train where, if you don't follow the rules or you make too much noise on the train, it'll negatively impact your score. Well, if I'm taking the silent car on the Acela or the Amtrak and someone's talking on their phone, shouldn't there be a reputational hit there? Again, I'm playing devil's advocate. I do not.
Well, in terms of playing devil's advocate, this system does potentially have some benefits according to local population. So interviewing people who live in China, particularly people who live in rural areas, they don't have credit cards. They don't have any credit history. So they see this as the only way, or one of the ways, that in the future they might have access to, to government benefits or to to banking loans. And they do see it as kind of like a legitimate part of their economy and potentially access to certain funds. But of course, from human rights perspective and from any other perspective, I mean, this is just problematic on so many levels. And the fact that, potentially starting, 2 years from now, if you're in China, you actually might be denied a credit at a bank, or you might be denied access to certain government benefits because your social credit is low, because you potentially wrote something against the government, or or did other things that Communist Party finds opposing.
We have seen periods of Chinese history where how loudly you were and how loudly loyal you were to the party had very, very deadly, serious implications.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll see how this develops, because and I will say that the browsing history and some of these things are only one part of social credit score. So some of your financial transactions and other data points are also part of it. So it's not that it only zeroes in on
again, to continue digging my own hole. So is it transparent what is going into this scoring system? So not entirely yet. So basically, several of Chinese domestic companies have been tasked to essentially develop an algorithm. So Tencent and Alibaba have already started implementing this through their own services, and they're kind of in the process of development. Okay. So then the Chinese government is hoping to learn from the experiment, and then start that. So I guess I wanted to switch topics a little bit. On your panel this morning, you mentioned something, hashtag poisoning, which is a term I had never heard before. I probably should have. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? It's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, on Twitter, people will use hashtags to better sort and find information. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of authoritarian governments doing lately is essentially try to spam a particular hashtag with nonsense. Okay. So then if you want to find pertinent information to, let's say, hashtag Bahraini protests, then you're essentially going to find posts about cat videos or whatever. So then basically you make that service and ability of people to find relevant tweets more difficult. And this morning in the panel, I used the example of Mexico, where protesters, anti-government protesters, were essentially posting information about police brutality, and they were posting very practical information at which streets and which checkpoints, people were facing, quite brutal response. So then other protesters could avoid it. And then the moment, this information was being posted, suddenly hashtag was being crowded by anything, again, from cat videos to, other unnecessary and irrelevant information. So then if you actually try to search through that hashtag, you couldn't find that info. And it really had real consequences, again, people getting beat up because they couldn't get to it.
So what do we do about this? Do you think the platforms have certain responsibilities? Should they be doing more here?
And I'd like to piggyback on that, actually, because, we talked about the governments that are scoring especially highly or poorly on your tracking But where does the company come in? And are there some platforms that are being better or doing better in tech freedom than others?
So in terms of the governments themselves and what can be done, I think a lot of this activity, particularly through hashtag poisoning, comes through the use of bots. So I think what would be very helpful is for the tech companies to be more proactive with labeling bot accounts as bot accounts. So
we need a reputation tracking system for that.
So because there is no perfect way of identifying bot accounts, but like there are quite a few kind of indicators, whether that be the frequency of tweeting or just like looking at the profile and the type of messaging and so forth. So it would be helpful.
Do you think that Twitter did a good job? I know that Twitter got some flack from WikiLeaks fans for the way that they categorized Russian bots as being basically, I don't know if this is completely accurate, so it might be inaccurate, but they said that, I think it was if you'd ever tweeted in Russian or tweeted from a Russian IP address or had a Russian account, then they flagged you or something, and that might be WikiLeaks spin.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly familiar with that WikiLeaks allegation, but generally, there are actually emerging programs out there that can identify bots. So I think like the bigger point here is that a lot of that activity comes from bots. So it would be good to try to at least identify them. I think even kind of trying to eliminate bot activity might be potentially problematic, just because you really you don't want to give that responsibility to a company to actually determine for certain whether something is a bot, but at least like if they exactly but at least if they label it, and if there is then dispute mechanism that like if they actually mislabel you, then like you can appeal it. I think like that could be one step forward. In terms of companies, how they're performing. So I think that's a good question, and I think like there are some people here at the conference who might be better equipped to answer that, because my research focuses on the role of governments. But but I will say that like if anything, some of the American social media companies like Facebook in particular, they have been trying to institute steps to combat this issue, and we can't really say that for a lot of non-Western companies. So for example, I mean, as you know, in China, the most popular social media companies are not, Facebook and Twitter. They're blocked, but they're, domestic alternatives, and they're never going to do that kind of stuff because, I mean, they essentially, are obligated to governments to respond to whatever makes sense for the Chinese government. Similarly, popular Russian social media network, whether that be WeContakte or Yandex and so forth, I mean, they're not doing anything. So we are seeing some emerging and potentially good steps done by the likes of Facebook and Google, but if anything. I think like we essentially need to ensure that that some of the steps that are being taken by these companies, that they're more widely adopted across the industry.
So I think we're running almost out of time here, but this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I would love to continue it for another half hour if we had the opportunity. I'm going to close on a rather open-ended question. I think we talked about hashtag
poisoning.
Yes. We talked about hashtag poisoning. We talked about bots and surveillance. On the tech freedom scorecard process, if you were to put your predictor hat on, or top-down view, what are the biggest threats or the biggest threat vectors, I guess, to tech freedom?
That's right. Well, as I mentioned, we've seen this rise of manipulation that is quite worrisome, whether that be through the use of pro-government commentators or political bots or fake news. And to me, that's actually quite worrisome because just because of the sheer nature of it and the number of people who are employed. And it's also not like a classical type of censorship. So then it's difficult to combat it because you can't say these commentators are not entitled to their own speech. So it becomes really tricky kind of from the legislative perspective. But in terms of some of the other things, for me, it's been quite worrisome to observe the number of internet shutdowns going up over the past couple of years. So those will be the governments actually shutting down either internet or mobile connections throughout the country or in part of the country. And, I think the whole world was outraged when that happened in Egypt, 6 or 7 years ago, but like this has actually become a worldwide trend.
Yeah.
So for example, like we've actually observed that
terrifying would that be?
in 17 or 18 countries over the past year. So so that's quite alarming.
Yeah.
We've also
Is America, I mean, do we have a strong foreign policy opinion on that we are pushing? And
So we are. So the U.S. has been quite outspoken in terms of internet shutdowns not being a legitimate response. But I
can't think of, honestly, as connected as I am, I have a hard time imagining anything a little more terrifying than waking up and suddenly being disconnected from everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. And I think, so in some countries, this is obviously happening during the times of protests or during the times of elections. In some of the other countries, like it's been a little bit more difficult because it does happen during the time of like national security crises. And we from the human rights perspective still see it as disproportionate response, but it becomes like a little bit more difficult to actually advocate against it if let's say the internet was shut down because there was a bomb threat that could have been initiated through like let's say the use of mobile internet or something along those lines. But I mean, this is definitely something that's on the rise, and it's quite alarming.
Any final questions?
Well, anything more uplifting to end on?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe we should ask a final question saying what are the reasons to be optimistic right now?
Well, the reasons are that as we started this conversation, we do see incredible examples of internet activism, and whether that be for women's rights or for religious and ethnic minorities, or even in terms of internet freedom, we're actually seeing now civil society becoming more adept in understanding the internet policy and trying to combat when negative legislation in their countries arises. And to me, that's quite promising. And I hope that as civil society, as well as the tech industry, learn to work together, and as they identify that this is their common goal, that free and open internet is not just a civil society and human rights issue, but it's also an economy issue and commerce issue, that they will start working together and present a greater force for the future.
Wow, what a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Sanja. This has
thank you.
been an absolutely incredible discussion. Thank you.
Awesome, great.